Last week, Facebook deleted a wide range of sites for little or no reason given. Many of these would have been inconvenient for the likes of Mark Zuckerberg. For every one congressman in the US, there are 7 lobbyists employed full-time to influence their politics. In Trinity College, we have something called the Classical Liberal Society.
Where demand is greatest and in which locations demand is greatest, we get an inalienable outcome, which is that the specialization in this context is the most efficient distribution you can get.
When under central planning from 1928 to 1989, the economy of the USSR grew every year without recession, while capitalist economies, like clockwork, plunge into recession typically every 10 years.
Like Stalin caused a famine in the Ukraine just to kill the Ukrainians because they had their own distinct ethnic heritage. But
information.
If it's historical revisionism, then no. We don't kidnap you and put you into concentration camps when you criticise our system. In fact, many people, Michael Moore, Bernie Sanders, Noam Chomsky, have become multi-millionaires by criticising capitalism. So it's sort of beautiful irony. You know, there's a market for left-wing nonsense.
The kinds of climate change catastrophe that we're facing kind of amounts to slaughtering the most vulnerable people on the planet with like drought and natural disasters and famines and shortages and whatever. And it's kind of carelessly done. I mean, it's kind of unnecessary as well.
If I don't want to give you my money, but you and your friends vote for a socialist alternative, eventually you have to take it from me. Which is the ultimate expression of non-consent in modern politics that we are allowed away with. And I like Karl Marx, I really do. I put him up there with J.K. Rowling and Stephen King as my favourite fiction authors.
Who's going to make my perfume in a planned economy? And I'm not talking about, you know, that cheap stuff. I mean, talking about where am I going to get my Gucci neckties, you know? Everything that makes me me.
Alright guys, I think we finally gotten all the laptops and all the phones recording. As you might have imagined, when Sargon of Akkad isn't around, the world and their ants isn't exactly handing up all their DSL cameras. So we're doing our best, and no, it's a really great thing that like two different societies with such different political backgrounds have come together. I remember when Josh Brady, who still hasn't accepted my friend request on Facebook, first added Fiachra McCann here to the chat. Fiachra said, "Didn't realise we've been collaborating with brainwashed capitalists who promote our bourgeoisie oppressors, trickle-down economics propaganda." But okay. So, without further ado, I'm going to leave it to our chair for the night, Donica, and he's going to get things going.
Okay, so just go through the general structure first. It'll be 7-minute speeches. First minute and last minute are protected time. That means no points of information can be offered during those time. After the first minute, I'll just bang the table, same as we come into the last minute. So in between the first minute and the last minute, you can, and PIs can be offered after that. In protected time, they cannot. Yeah, and we'll just go through all the speeches, and then there'll be a Q&A sort of thing afterwards. So, without further ado, if we're all good, wait, which side is going first again?
Who's speaking first? It's a rock, paper, scissors.
Alright.
Oh, okay.
I'm the best at rock, paper, scissors.
Rock, paper, scissors.
Yeah.
Their debate settled, that's the end.
Yeah, well, alright. Okay, so,
we're going first or second?
You choose.
Oh, we're going first.
Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker of the night, representing the Workers Party, Fiachra McCann.
Why couldn't the anarchist draw a straight line? Because he had no ruler. Why couldn't the libertarian cross the road? Because it was private property. Now, socialism isn't just better because it provides more social services for people and gives people better wages and is generally just a good idea. But actually, there's a lot of social problems that we have in capitalist societies, which socialist societies can kind of do away with. A number of studies have shown that actually in socialist societies, life satisfaction is actually significantly higher. And of course, there's a number of reasons to explain this. In socialist countries, health is a lot better for citizens. Child and infant mortality rates are significantly lower. There's better healthcare services. Calorie intake is actually higher, but from 12 to 15% in socialist societies. August Bebel and Clara Zetkin argued that only through socialism can we actually see women's emancipation. Under capitalism, women cannot both raise children and actually enter the workforce. So through socialism, we need to give proper child services to women, proper child benefits to women, and we can't, of course, do that under capitalism. For women not having independent income, under capitalist society, it's actually impossible for them to get divorced unless they're not actually escaping domestic problems and domestic violence and so on and so forth. In East Germany, where women had a wide range of social services for child benefits and things like that, and 91% of women in East Germany of childbearing age chose to have children, which is significantly higher than that of West Germany. In 1982, 1,112 towns in East Germany had a female mayor. At the same time, however, West Germany, the much larger West Germany, only had 12 female mayors. In the 1980s, the number of women in major positions in the Communist Party was around the same as men. In no capitalist society can say the same thing. As capitalists use immigrants from abroad as a means of cheap labor, racial tensions emerge, and as a side effect, they're turning working class people against each other. For the sake of super exploitation, the labor from certain segments of society in capitalist interest it is in the capitalist interest that certain segments of society are marginalized so that they can then use these as a form of super exploitation. That would explain why major corporations have supported far-right fascist and apartheid regimes in Israel, Nazi Germany, and South Africa. Half a century after the civil rights movement in the USA, the USA is still divided along racial lines, and the African American community is still discriminated against in several aspects. Cuba, however, at the same time, have managed to completely erase all racial tensions under their socialist government. The complete commercialization of every aspect of our lives has completely destroyed local cultures and traditions across the globe. Socialist governments have done a lot to restore...
Point of information?
No, thank you. Socialist governments have done a lot to restore these cultures. Thomas Sankara demanded that all civil servants wear traditional clothing when they work. The Soviets produce hundreds of films each year in a wide range of minority languages, such as Azerbaijani, Armenian, and even Yiddish. Nowhere in the USA or any Western country produces films in Yiddish. The Soviets published a wide range of classical literature to promote, to restore classical literature. So much so that during the communist era, 3 out of every 5 books in the world were produced in the USSR. Capitalism is often praised as being a meritocracy, which rewards people based on hard work or smart investments. In reality, that's not actually the case. Class hegemony and privilege is reinforced by the fact that rich parents can simply buy their children a better education. Those from wealthy backgrounds inherit large sums of property from their parents, while those from poorer backgrounds inherit nothing. Contrary to misconception, socialism doesn't mean that everyone gets paid the same wages despite education or work. Karl Marx explicitly argued against this. Socialism still means more people with better education or harder workers can get paid higher or have other perks or benefits. Under capitalism, everything becomes a commodity. This includes politics and the media, and ultimately means that it actually silences people who go against the ruling class's interest. Ultimately, businesses who have enough money can choose to can propagate lies about the environment, vaccines, and even trickle-down economics. Major corporations can influence news stories based on where to invest in advertisement. All major politicians require funding from somewhere. As Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton gave billions worth of fighter jets to Saudi Arabia. After this, Boeing gave a large donation
Point of information?
No, thank you. Boeing gave a large donation to her presidential campaign. Last week, Facebook deleted a wide range of sites for little or no reason given. Many of these would have been inconvenient for the likes of Mark Zuckerberg. For every one congressman in the US, there are 7 lobbyists employed full-time to influence their politics. Even here in Trinity College, we have something called the Classical Liberal Society. Despite not actually being CSC recognized, is getting a large number of donations from major wealthy people to promote their trickle-down economic theory.
You'll enjoy the pizza later.
Oh, we will, of course. You'll enjoy our cans more. Unfortunately, the poor Workers Party TCD can only afford to buy Tesco lager because we don't actually get these large donations. So for all of these wide range of reasons and many more that I didn't actually get into, we feel that socialism is just significantly better. It solves many, many, many problems that capitalism can't. Thank you.
We'd like to thank Vicar for his fine speech and call on Mark Hennessy to open the case for the Classical Liberal Society.
Where is it? So, what we got in that last speech was a lot of arguments about why, in certain circumstances, certain things are better under certain conditions in a socialist system, and in certain conditions, a capitalist system is bad. But I don't really think that's a valid mechanism for evaluating something as integral and broad as which economic system should we use. In economics, we call this locally valid results and extrapolating solely from those, right? And that's because while we might observe, for example, what was one of those things? The commodification of everything. We might disagree with that, right? And that might exist in some capitalist economies. Clearly, that doesn't exist in every capitalist economy, and more so. Sorry, Con. You can regulate those things if we believe that normatively, morally, it's undesirable for those things to be true.
Shame.
That doesn't prove in and of itself why we shouldn't operate within a capitalist framework that is regulated, a free market framework that is regulated, as opposed to a socialist, centrally planned system. And that's essentially the extent of the debate from the other side so far. All of the examples he gave are just specific conditions where some things are bad and some things are good. That doesn't really tell us anything about the broader picture. So now that I've spent 1.5 minutes explaining that, I'm going to quickly try to explain some of the theoretical backing that underpins, this is a generalizable backing rather, that underpins why I believe a free market system is almost inalienably better than a socialist system. So I'm going to lay out a couple of areas where a market economy, through the price mechanism, has a unique advantage over a centralized, centrally planned economy. This is not extensive, but I hope it illustrates why free markets have at least some advantages over socialist systems and why they're desirable in an empirical fashion when we first specify productivity or wealth creation as an outcome. Now, of course, I know that there's a wealth distribution concern, which I'll get onto. Then, if I have time, I'm probably not going to have time, but then I'll try to bridge the gap with some assertions about the empirical uncertainty under which they are arguing, and then essentially attempt to bridge the normative stance in that way. So firstly, transaction cost internalization is a big reason why the price mechanism is so fundamentally advantaged over a centrally planned economy, right? So if you want to make a trade, You have to spend time and other resources finding the right person to trade with and then arranging and initiating the trade, right? So transaction costs, that's what those are important to this debate because it is necessary to internalize their effect for a market to function properly, right? So failure to internalize these costs, that is, have them dynamically affect the price system or the production and consumption of those goods, which exists even in a centrally planned system, means that you will get failures in the market, right? So when these prices affect the costs of producing goods, consumers and governments can then make decisions about how to allocate their spending on these goods with these costs in mind, right? So a centrally planned system cannot internalize these costs both because of a comparative lack of information they possess and because they do not have a mechanism, in this case the price system, which communicates the comparative costs of taking actions in a full manner, right? So a key aspect to note here is the price system communicates all aspects that contribute to the production of a good without having to fully explain these aspects of production and consumption functions, right? So it means that we don't need to internalize the cost. Every productive and consuming actor doesn't need to first internalize the complex market mechanisms contributing to the production and consumption of goods. They only need to know what is the price of a good, right? So for example, in fact, no, I'm gonna move on to the second one. So specialization is another example where the free market mechanism or free markets have a unique advantage, right? That's because specialization is limited by the extent of the market, okay? And what this means is that how specialized a given occupation can be is determined by the extent to which there is a market for that good, right? And how large the overall market is. So suppose you are a medically trained professional and you can service at most a 5-kilometer radius, which would be the extent of your market, right? With your serviceable area then, right, the type of medical professional that you can become is determined by your market extent, right? So if you live in a very large economic area, you might be able to specialize as like a neurosurgeon or a heart surgeon, right? Whereas if you live in a small area, you have to specialize in a broader field because the kind of people you're going to run into, you're not going to run into that many people who have medical problems in any one given year, right? Whereas if you live in a very large economy, you can, right? So some key observations about this mechanism, right? So foremostly, only a market mechanism can provide this result. This is because the allocation of medical professionals in a society is determined by supply and demand, incentivizing a very particular distribution of individuals, of the medical professionals, and what they specialize in. Because it's observable through the price mechanism, but also through essentially supply and demand, where demand is greatest and in which locations demand is greatest, we get an inalienable outcome, which is that the specialization in this context is the most efficient distribution you can get. The second thing is that distributionally, we get the best possible medical outcome because these people are in an optimal position, essentially. So the specialization occurs where it is needed most, and that means that everyone, providing they can pay for things, right, can actually purchase the service, right? But the social justice problem, which is obviously contingent on this question, is actually a different question, and that's because through government. So, for example, if we specify normatively, morally, that we prefer a minimum standard of care for all participants in society, or an equal outcome in all society, we can affect this at the demand level, which would solve the social aspect care while still allowing the price mechanism to function. Thanks.
We'd like to thank Mark for his fine speech and call on Josh Brady to continue the case for the Workers Party.
There has been no more egregious misrepresentation of an idea than that of communism. In particular, socialist economies, nations, and people have been presented unilaterally as failures which relied upon brutality to enforce their will. Tonight, 3 claims will be made. 1. Socialism better provides to people. 2. Socialism is not inefficient. 3. Comparisons side by side showed that socialism outperforms capitalism by several metrics. By socialism, I'm referring to a system that historically existed in 40% of the world and continues to exist in Cuba and Asian countries, not some wishy-washy PvP notion. It is often claimed that socialism is economically inefficient or socialism collapsed in socialist countries. However, centrally planned economies could produce full employment, guaranteed pensions, paid maternity, limits on working hours, free healthcare, education, 99% literacy, subsidized vacations, inexpensive housing, low-cost childcare, subsidized transport, and income equality. Most of the benefits we want in an economy. The question is, are these achievable without driving up a major deficit? The answer is yes. When under central planning from 1928 to 1989, the economy of the USSR grew every year without recession, while capitalist economies, like clockwork, plunge into recession typically every 10 years. The lack of recession built into a planned economy is one of the major advantages it holds. The industrialization of a backwards feudalist Russia into a superpower in 12 years stands as one of the greatest economic achievements in history. In contrast, the sudden decline in Russia due to capitalist shock therapy, which was not limited to the economy, but also to life expectancy, birth rates, workers' rights, full employment, women's rights, healthcare, education, all of which has plummeted the country since. Similar results can be found in every other former socialist country which has turned to capitalism and many of which have not made the same economic recovery as Russia, made possible only by Russia's natural gas supply. After World War II, the Eastern Bloc was rocked by war and was in desperate poverty, and similarly, Russia, China, Vietnam had all been plagued by immense feudalistic poverty by the time before revolution. Often these countries lacked an industrial base, hence socialist central planning will play a key role in the development of industry and agriculture. A centrally planned economy allows socialist countries to concentrate on economic strengths that would allow the country to develop quickly with minimum waste. Central planning authorities were able to establish fixed prices, eliminate inflation, mostly, and guarantee full employment due to being able to effectively avoid recession. Nope. One of the essential factors in the pricing mechanism was that the expense of goods was calculated for their cost rather than for the preference of profit. As a result, purchasing power for necessity greatly outweighed that in capitalist societies. According to Austin Murphy, the prices of goods and services were typically the same and of the same type and quality were the same everywhere in socialist nations. Furthermore, prices for perishable consumer goods and services between 1960 and 1990 varied less than 1%, while wages increased 50% in the same period. In the capitalist pricing system, conversely, has numerous issues. Prices were more heterogeneous and arbitrary in capitalist countries. The lack of perfectly competitive markets under capitalism results in highly arbitrary prices amongst competitors which fail to clear stock inventory, hence waste and inefficiency. i.e., the failure to use all available materials and labor, which results in unpurchased/spoiled goods and unemployment, which are inherent to a market pricing system. Critics of socialism often point to centrally planned economies like that of East Germany and compare them to richer economies like West Germany. While these comparisons often lazily omit the benefits reaped from imperialism, at least this example includes both countries, which were once part of the German Empire. Of the 100 billion Deutschmarks paid in war reparations, 98% was paid by East Germany. This took an enormous toll on the economy, which the East German income per capita was only 40% of the West German level by 1950. Despite this setback, by 1989, due to successful economic strategies, the East German income per capita had risen to more than 66% of the West German level. Oh, wrong page. However, aggregate statistical evidence that indicates East Germany was... Anyway, no, I've got it. Okay, where the fuck was I? I hate this. Anyway, sorry. Moreover, aggregate statistical evidence indicates that that East German system was more efficient for spurring economic growth than West Germany. In the period from 1961 to 1989, when the East German economy was not hemorrhaging from migration, the net national product per capita increased on average 4.5% per annum, while the West German figure was on average 2.5%. This is particularly significant in that both of these countries were developed industrial states by 1961, meaning there was no industrialization process that would account for a disproportionate and illusionary economic growth. The achievement of a 4.5% growth rate in a developed country compares incredibly well to a market economy. Wage differentials in East Germany were 1 to 3, while in West Germany they were 1 to 20. GDP per capita is actually more accurately reflects average wage incomes in East Germany than in West Germany. Hence, working wages were much closer into the two territories than one is initially believed by the GDP per capita numbers. Furthermore, it is worth noting that in many respects, the centralized nature of publicly owned enterprises in East Germany were actually extremely similar to the large-scale industrial levels of West Germany, with the major exception being profit. Given the economic superiority of central planning in a number of terms, such as economic growth, price clearing, the ability to supply necessities at cheaper rates, elimination of inflation, and overall the reduction of waste and inefficiency, the claims of inefficiency in socialism are shown to be highly lacking. In 28 and 30 comparisons between countries at similar levels of economic development, socialist countries showed to be more favorable in physical quality of life outcomes. By 1990, all Eastern European socialist countries ranked in the top 40 of the Human and Development Index, with the DDR sitting at 20th place. For comparison, Japan was first, Canada 5th, West Germany 12th, Ireland 17th, and the US 18th. Ultimately, socialist central planning compares quite favorably to the capitalist market economies. The only difference is who benefits, workers or shareholders. Ladies and gentlemen, I came here tonight to deliver a simple message. Communism works. And it has worked for hundreds of millions of people, and continues to work in socialist republics today. It turned desperately poor countries into places where everyone had food, medical care, and education. This is not a system of failure. This is something where imperial forces have attempted to suffocate it since its beginning. And to those of us who come from poor families, who work for a living, this is very impressive. Please consider socialism. Thank you.
We'd like to thank Josh for his fine speech and call on James Martin to continue the case for the Classical Liberal Society.
First of all, Josh referred to communist nations as failures that relied upon brutality. Entirely correct. I could not have put that better myself. We heard a lot of statistics about East Germany and West Germany, but it's important just to contextualise those as being locally valid empirical observations with no analysis behind the actual mechanism, which is a vital aspect of any sort of economic debate. But to my main point, I'm not entirely sure why I'm here tonight. Not in like a vague existential sense, like I don't know why I'm here in this room talking about economics. Ostensibly it's about food, but I don't really like economics, don't really understand economics, don't really understand emotion. But most of all, I don't understand why anyone is a communist. I mean, we don't have a proper valid excuse. We all have access to a world-class library with 5 million books from the past 4,000 years, which conveniently includes history books from the past 100 years. Now, I have a certain degree of interest in evidence being able to illuminate the decision-making processes, including a lot of our present economic dichotomy, but I think we should frame tonight's discourse on the relative merits of capitalism and communism by considering past implementations of either systems and the Workers' Party, their Marxist, Leninist, Socialist, Communist, whatever ideology. But so it's important to contextualise the conditions that require communism to operate in. So it seems appropriate to mention the myriad of intrinsic deficiencies that communist states have. The concentration camps, the secret police, the disregard for human life, the constant purges, the indifference and at worst hostility to individual rights. All of these are prerequisites to establish a communist state. To an uninformed observer, they could conceivably conclude that the purpose of communism was to maximise human suffering and to raise it to levels never before seen in human history. But we are informed observers. Now, we're all familiar with all of that. I mean, frankly impressive list of atrocities. I say impressive, as one would assume, wow, this economic system seems so inherently toxic and hostile to human life that it must have some redeeming qualities that make up for it. But it doesn't. Like, it just doesn't, and it really confuses me. But that's a total side issue. I'm not sure what inspires this quasi-religious devotion to a, ironically enough, atheistic dogma. But whatever communists lack in coherent functioning economic systems, they definitely overcompensate for an ideological fervour. I mean, as communism approaches reality, things become cost prohibitive. Like, what I'm trying to get at is, I see no practical or empirical basis for implementing a communist state that directly regulates every aspect of the economy. It's an ideological conviction that must be followed through despite the flurry of disastrous consequences. I think I've rebuttal somewhere. It also seems appropriate to draw the delineation between capitalist states with a lot of social programs like the Nordic model, like Norway, Sweden, etc., and actual proper socialist economies like the Soviet Union, that just ran literally every facet of everyone's life, because it doesn't really seem fair to compare them. And yeah, I'm not sure like what the point of linking feminism with communism is. Like, I mean, I'm not sure what the progress of women's liberation is when women can just be randomly kidnapped and tortured by secret police whenever they feel like it. So, yeah, and also on the minorities part, the Soviet Union were notorious for just suppressing all other ethnic minorities in order to create a sort of Soviet monolith. Like Stalin caused a famine in the Ukraine just to kill the Ukrainians because they had their own distinct ethnic heritage. But
information.
If it's historical revisionism, then no.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a vast literature of evidence to suggest from many different bourgeois scholars, not communist scholars, that these claims aren't true. So what are you basing this off of?
Well, there are a lot of scholars who say the Holocaust didn't happen, but they're renownedly mocked in the academic historical community. Same with those people, as in Stalin caused a famine in the Ukraine. Simple as. Now, I mean, say what you like about capitalism, and you actually can. We don't kidnap you and put you into concentration camps when you criticise our system. In fact, many people, Michael Moore, Bernie Sanders, Noam Chomsky, have become multi-millionaires by criticising capitalism. So it's sort of beautiful irony. You know, there's a market for, left-wing nonsense, but so when you make books or movies, you invest your time in creating a product, people want that product, they exchange their money without coercion for that product, you get money. So, in a weird way, critiquing capitalism sort of fundamentally underscores how great capitalism is. It sort of...
Sure.
Go on.
Yeah, whether you like it or not, the CIA, or whether you like socialism or not, the CIA was definitely going around assassinating democratically elected leaders all across the world.
Allende had it coming. I'm not sure about the other ones, but... too soon for the Allende jokes. Wow, misread this crowd. Finally, but yeah, so the common theme of centrally planned economies is abject failure and the introduction of widespread scarcity. This is a system that has every opportunity to succeed in the last 100 years. The problem isn't that real communism hasn't been tried, it's that people just keep trying to implement it. Thank you very much. Propose.
I'd like to thank James for his fine speech and call on Cormac Newton to close the case for the Workers' Party.
Okay, hi everyone. This is my first ever debate, so I'm really excited for that. Thanks for the classical liberals for being here and for the chance to talk this out. So I was asked tonight, what would it take for me to renounce socialism, renounce the Workers' Party? So these are the biggest reasons that I feel in favor of socialism. Of course, a lot of people are not going to agree. That's fine, sure. So in my opinion, the way I see it, capitalism has failed. And of course, we can talk about the various failures of socialism. There are plenty. We hear that socialism fails everywhere it's been tried. It only works on paper, not in practice, whatever. But it's an interesting double standard because I'm about to list a bunch of massive failures of capitalism that you're all aware of anyway. I'm not inventing anything new. I mean, the list of failed states that are capitalist in the world is pretty vast. I mean, we don't tend to think of places like Bangladesh or Malawi or Guatemala or whatever as capitalist, like maybe of course you do, because they are, but it's not necessarily the first thing that comes to mind. We typically think of Sweden, France, the United States, Australia, Japan, whatever. And they're failed states purely because of the kind of global economic order we have. That's not necessarily intrinsic to all capitalism, but certainly the way it's operating at the moment. I also don't think it's true that socialism has failed everywhere it's been tried. I mostly agree with Josh, in fact, about the various achievements of socialism, but as well as that, just for examples that are much more applicable to the current age, I'm going to list 2 specific examples of where I feel that there's a lot of lessons to be learned and applied in the future. So what's wrong with capitalism? I'm going to quote Pope Francis. This is, this is a simple thing. There is little awareness of problems which especially affect the excluded. And the excluded is the majority of the planet's population, billions of people. These days, they're mentioned in international political and economic discussions, but one often has the impression that their problems are brought up as an afterthought, a question which gets added almost out of duty or in a tangential way, if not treated merely as collateral damage. So what we have there is billions of people in abject poverty living on whatever it is, $1, under $2, whatever a day, enormous problems, just a huge disparity between, people just living on the absolute bare minimum. It's really shocking. And that's just in the background of our daily lives all the time. When we know about sweatshops, we know that if we drink coffee, it came from some really helpless, exploited worker in Guatemala getting whipped every day or whatever. We know about sweatshops, we know about, shoes and footballs and all the rest. That's just the way that supply chains work, and that's the way that the global economic system is ordered, so that these
One
states...
question?
Sure.
But doesn't capitalism raise 179,000 people out of abject poverty every day?
Well, you can look at it in a lot of ways. Any system that raises people out of poverty, there's obviously a lot of pros and cons. Obviously, Josh listed a lot of things about communism that listed a lot of people out of poverty in a much shorter time frame. And at the same time, we can also say about socialist states in the past that they're also really horrible. Compared to Ireland today, we don't want to live in Soviet Russia. However, do we want to live in Tsarist Russia? No. Tsarist Russia, compare it to Soviet Russia, it's night and day. As well, there's other systems in the past that have raised people out of poverty comparatively to, whatever. Feudal... Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
So the problem in this debate is that I can say these capitalist economies are good, and you can say these socialist economies are good, but without any analysis of the mechanism through which those differences occur, there's no comparative here. At the end of the day, the audience doesn't have anything to think on. So is there any mechanistic aspect of socialism that you can say is better than capitalism in that it creates wealth, or whatever your normative claim is? Normative objective.
I suppose not, I guess. I'm still new to this. There's a lot I have to learn.
Sorry, I wasn't sure.
Oh, that's good. Hey, you're right. You absolutely are right. You can accuse both sides here of kind of cherry picking data or whatever you like. That's a fair observation, I think. But I'll state my case and see what you have to think, I guess. I'll vaguely go into something like that, I guess. How much time is that?
Oh no, it's 4:47.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so yeah, so we all know about this 2030 report, the point at which it's a turning point. We will be unable to prevent a rise of 2 degrees, and certainly in my opinion, that's a direct result of the kinds of relationships we have to multinationals like ExxonMobil and Shell and BP, blah blah blah, just giving them the power to do whatever they want. The kinds of climate change catastrophe that we're facing kind of amounts to slaughtering the most vulnerable people on the planet with drought and natural disasters and famines and shortages and whatever. And it's kind of carelessly done. It's kind of unnecessary as well. Global wildlife populations, we learned the other day, they've fallen by 60% in just over 4 decades. And that's not causing anyone to say capitalism only works in theory or only on paper or whatever. That's just, I find that to be a double standard that's kind of strange. As well as that, okay, so the US military is the top polluter, and the richest people on the planet are addicted to wealth. They will destroy anything, and if they can profit from it, that includes half the world's population if necessary. So the 2 examples I'm going to mention is, it's Cuba following the fall of the Soviet Union and Burkina Faso. So with Cuba, what I'm referring to specifically is how they've managed their agriculture sector. After the fall of the Soviet Union, their main trading partner They lost access to cheap oil and to fertilizers and to pesticides. So they had to invent essentially like an entirely new system from scratch to prevent famine. And they did, which is really interesting because it's kind of unique in that way. Systems that are under embargo, like South Africa or Iraq or like any country under sanctions, they typically don't prioritize things like sustainability or the ecological footprint. But that's what Cuba did. So they managed to get a quarter of their agriculture to be organic. They did it without the use of chemicals. Their world-renowned health and education systems were intact. So Burkina Faso, Burkina Faso is the most interesting example. And if anyone is interested about it, please talk to me afterwards because I think everyone should know about it. Burkina Faso between 83 and 87 just went crazy. Okay, you can talk to me about it. But anyway, I'll end with a quote. This is a quote by one guy. I'm convinced there's only one way to eliminate these grave evils, namely through establishment of a socialist economy. In such an economy, the means of production are owned by society itself and are utilized in a planned fashion. I think some of you might know who said that. That man's name was Albert Einstein. Thanks for listening.
We'd like to thank Cormac for his fine speech and call on Damien Gerard to close the case of the classical liberal society and the debate as a whole.
Thank you for that. I don't really know whether I'm going to be getting too much applause from certain sections of the room after this, but I am here to implore you to renounce the failed promises of socialism and to join us on the side of freedom.
Hear, hear.
Thank you. So, I was going to take this seriously, then I realised it was the Workers' Party and that they weren't even allowed in the alphabetic spaghetti that makes the Irish far left what it is today. So I decided to take this as a bit of a joke, which is normally what they are considered in Irish politics. And as they should be. And why is that? There is no system yet discovered in the history of humanity with the potential to lift people from abject poverty than free market capitalism. And to prove that point, from the view of the socialist, communist, Marxists, neo-Leninists, whatever they want to call themselves, NPCs, whatever they want to call themselves today, in the mid-20th century, they turned from the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat to an identity politics model, where they had to have some oppressor and some oppressee, whereby when people became wealthy, they decided that it wasn't actually hating the factory owners. People became wealthy, and they moved away from socialism, so you needed a new niche. So you're actually quite good at marketing, despite the fact that you hate everything that entails. On to the present day. How would socialism benefit people as you have suggested? Well, I took some notes from what you had said. And from the first speaker, you had said, well, there was no inheritance tax as the goal. Now, what is the role of inheritance tax? Inheritance tax is the dissipation of your stored wealth to whomsoever you decide to give it to upon your death. What is the effect of an inheritance tax? Or how many people in this room would be in favour of an inheritance tax? If you would.
What percent?
Well, they would say 100%. I read their manifesto today, the Workers' Party manifesto. It's available online. What percentage? They want 100, yeah?
Yeah.
You want 100?
Yeah.
So what is the effect of a 100% inheritance tax?
20%. Like, I'm probably more on the side of capitalism, but I still think inheritance tax and things like that should.
Okay, so we'll leave you in Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael where you belong, in the centre, and we'll stick to somebody with convictions. So, Miss, can you elaborate on your point of why you think 100 is? Because you gave me the point of information, so I want to make this as...
No, well, I don't think so, but I just...
Okay, so what is the effect of 100% inheritance tax?
It's not really meant to be like...
Oh, sorry. It seems that there was point of information, but okay, I'll continue. But anyway, the point of... I'll answer your question for you. So the point of 100% inheritance tax is to stop people accumulating wealth at that level. The problem with that is that people don't accumulate wealth for the sake of accumulating wealth. They accumulate wealth to invest it and to create and to move on. People don't just have money under their pillow. They do it because even though we're an individualistic society, we're also a family society and we build dynasties. That has been the way it has been throughout human history. We don't simply give up our wealth voluntarily. which is what they want you to do. And the core of this debate is force versus freedom. In a capitalistic society or in a free market society, we get together and we do things based on what the market wants. In any transition to a socialist society, you have to eventually get to a point of force. If I don't want to give you my money, but you and your friends vote for a socialist alternative, eventually you have to take it from me. Which is the ultimate expression of non-consent in modern politics that we are allowed away with. And I like Karl Marx, I really do. I put him up there with J.K. Rowling and Stephen King as my favourite fiction authors. Because it is a nonsense. And it's a nonsense that we have listened to for 21 minutes, where we talk about the virtue of a system that doesn't work, is highly immoral, is based on theft, and has been responsible for the murder and oppression of more people throughout human history than any other system devised, and we're putting that against the system which has lifted more people from abject poverty than any other system yet discovered in human history. So whatever iteration of Marxism or Marxist-Leninism that you want to bring up, it has achieved nothing. There is no invention in a socialist system or a socialist country. One of the speakers earlier on talked about the calorie levels that people had in socialist countries were more than the calorie levels brought up in poorer capitalist countries. Sorry, there's your water bottle. The problem with that was that, yeah, okay, that was when I decided this debate wasn't serious, because I thought, yeah, okay, eventually Venezuela will run out of barbecued leopard. And then it won't happen. This is the problems that we have with a socialist country. I came into this thinking this was going to be serious, and then I really just got to it, and I just said, this is a fiction. This is a fiction. This may as well be a Harry Potter novel. And we're juxtaposing that against the one system that has lifted more people out of poverty that you had to rebrand yourself. So it could no longer be the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, that it had to be postmodernism and identity politics. And it had to be met... Yeah, go on, you can have one.
We have proletariat written in our manifesto. We don't have this identity politics thing we're talking about.
Yeah, those are liberals, not us.
Sorry?
Liberals believe in all that nonsense.
Okay, so those are the different ones.
Those are the other ones. They're essentially have proletariat written in our thing. That's what I'm trying to say. It's just a weird... This is not...
Which point?
The proletariat thing. I'm not following this shift from proletariat thing. It's literally written in our manifesto.
Oh, the shift from the proletariat to, for example, you were talking about in your manifesto, you're the only people who will work for women's rights, or minority rights, or other rights, or segmenting society based on groups. That is in your general election manifesto.
Right, but we're not getting rid of proletariat.
I didn't say you were getting rid of proletariat. I said you have widened your span because proletariat doesn't work, because as people get more wealthy, they realise, and the elections prove it, and people voting with their feet also prove it. There is nobody trying to swim 90 miles from Miami in shark-infested waters to get to your high literacy Havana. It's just not happening. Nobody had to build walls to keep people in West Germany. Nobody had to build walls to keep people in Seoul, South Korea. No, you already had one. And nobody had to build walls from China to Hong Kong to keep people in. So while we are building on this on a very serious theoretical debate, and okay, socialism in theory is great, capitalism in theory is great, and capitalism does have its flaws. No ideology is without its flaws. The problem with communism and socialism and any other thing is that when it's been tried, it has abjectly failed, and the people who vote for it are the ones who suffer the most. So please, I implore you, err on the side of freedom. Although capitalism is only a necessary requirement, it is not a sufficient requirement. We do need to work as hard as we possibly can to create the society that we want, and that is based on opportunity and it's based on freedom. I implore you to vote for proposed. Thank you.
We'd like to thank Damien for his fine speech. We're now going to open the floor to questions. What time are you finishing up again?
40 past.
40, okay.
7 minutes.
So we've got... Do you want to extend it a bit longer? Or
yeah, we'll give it like 15 minutes, yeah.
Okay, so open the floor for questions for either side, any of the speakers.
Is there a room for a sensible middle ground?
Once again, and again.
We'll consider that answered then.
Both sides.
Who's it directed towards?
Everyone.
But, I mean...
you personally.
Well, I would think that So a centrally planned system, as opposed to a free market system, like a free market system, I know it's a classical liberal society, so in theory, like maybe we should all be advocating for like anarcho-capitalism. But for the most part, capitalist systems, that can actually be empirically observed, that exist at present, I would assume are middle ground, as in, I mean, even in the American case, like, they still have large social service provision and things like that. Would you define that as a middle ground, or what do you mean by a middle ground?
Well, you're saying the answer is yes?
Yes. Well, yeah, obviously.
I was really just hoping I might annoy both sides by asking that question.
Don't worry.
Yeah, sorry, I think, well, at least those two are, I imagine they're more annoyed than
I'm happy enough.
Yes?
Sorry, the last man who spoke.
Hey.
You mentioned as a negative, seemingly, that the Workers' Party has women's rights and minority rights in the manifesto. Were you saying that's a bad thing?
No, I didn't. No, of course not. I didn't mention it as a negative point, and I would never mention it as a negative point. I said they re-clarified themselves as being the only place where that has happened. And I then compounded that by saying if you look at the ways in which women's careers have progressed, particularly from institutions like this into the biggest companies in the world, capitalism has raised more women from abject poverty than any other system devised, and that is what I said. So of course, it would be a pithy comment to say, yes, they're bad things. No, of course they're not bad things. And they would never be ever construed to be bad things by any person involved in this debate on either side. But it's realistically the best way in which to do it. And the best way to do it is not to create division. The best way to do it is to create it by economic gains, where most people have the most freedom of choice for the life that they want to lead. Women, minorities, any group included. The most important aspect for us is we don't care what group you're from. We just want to do every interaction with you based on consent and based on some form of mutual exchange. And beyond that, I don't care who you are or what you do or what your background is. And that is
you're in favour of it, so why did you bring that up as a point?
Why did I bring it up? Oh, because the bourgeoisie proletariat divide marketing of Marxism and socialism was not working in the mid-20th century.
Minority rights and women's rights have been there from the beginning in socialist countries. That's always been a priority, just as installing socialism has been a priority. So why are you suggesting that there's been some kind of change? And you mentioned postmodernism as well. I don't see...
Why did I mention it as a change?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, those principles have been there from the beginning. So what change is it?
I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure about women's rights, for example, in Cuba. I'm not so sure about womenens' rights in North Korea. I'm not so sure about women's rights in a lot of different countries.
Sorry, we're going to have to...
And we have to cut that short. But
anyone else? Yourself?
Yeah, I'd like to ask anyone on the Workers' Party side of the debate. I want to ask, in a centrally planned economy, where am I going to get water that's sparkling? I get water from, the government or wherever, and I go, can I get some carbon in that? No, feck off, who's going to make my perfume in a planned economy? And I'm not talking about, that cheap stuff. I mean, talking about real stuff. Where am I going to get my Gucci neckties? Everything that makes me me. What is possible?
Okay, Grant, so how could he remain as stylish as he currently is?
So I think there's this idea that in the centrally planned economies, they don't have nice things, right? And I think that's kind of a I think it's kind of silly. I mean, if you look at the GDR, for example, so 10% of industry was actually privately owned. So there was room for smaller businesses to set up and basically make products like sparkling water. But also there was democratic systems where you could write in and demand certain products, and then that would kind of aggregate, statistically. There's other things like importing luxury goods. For example, you could buy Levi jeans in the GDR. You could buy your Coca-Cola. It was just hard, and it just came at certain times a year, but it did come. Really, the biggest shortage they ever had was actually on pineapples. That was bizarre, but that was their main shortage. Other things, not so much. So yeah, you could remain stylish. You could have some private, you could set up your own business. You could do all these things. It's just most of the economy is centrally planned, and most of it is for, is for making sure there's jobs and making sure that there's that wages go on and all that stuff. Fair enough.
Right. Yourself?
Yeah, sort of two questions. One's mainly economic in the first part. I sort of noticed a lot of the introductions to sort of the communist side was it doesn't need to be imposed by force, but some of the examples then, for example, the first speaker said about or sort of critiqued the likes of big corporations for Facebook, like Mark Zuckerberg, for removing videos. If you compare that there, the actual amount of power the government have in socialist countries, like you used a lot of the extreme examples with the Soviet Union and Cuba, then get to China, but do you not think it's more of a threat on people's civil liberties in socialist countries, such as the ones you mentioned, as opposed to one where, like, I personally think that giant corporatism is an issue and the laissez-faire capitalist system at hand, but on the two extremes, I think it's more of a threat to your civil liberties living in the extreme socialist situation as opposed to the corporatist system that we're sort of living in now. The second question is more about your sort of ideas on individual policies. For example, I think the actual rate of income tax, there's a lot of evidence to show that lower rates of corporation tax, lower rates of income tax can actually generate more revenue. Would you not be in favour of things like that there if it actually does lead to better funded public programmes as opposed to just committing to complete egalitarianism, 100% inheritance tax, etc.?
You want to take the first question?
Yeah, alright. In terms of the first question, I think one of the things that people sort of need to consider is that the greater threat there is to the society, and to the government, and that, not even just in socialist countries, but, if you look at in the USSR, in places like Cuba or other places with huge capitalist encirclement, trying, with conspiracies, trying to actually undermine the socialist regime, there will, of course, respond to that with a more authoritarian stance. So and you do see that in capitalist countries as well, the level of, the threat which the US faced after 9/11, I know I'm going a bit off topic here, was was tiny, the threat of terrorism, but still they resorted to, Guantanamo Bay concentration camps. They did silence, people who were, people who were allegedly promoting terrorism and things like that. So you see this kind of thing in both capitalist and socialist governments. You do see governments stepping in. I suppose if once that threat was gone, we could if we had a world revolution, we could then I suppose have a more democratic system, and we could actually have more freedoms of speech.
But people do still criticize, people in America and in the Western world still have the freedom to criticize things like Guantanamo Bay and the mass surveillance, whereas they're not threatened to go to a gulag.
Alright, well, there were, they still had some freedom to, in communist societies, but as I said, the threat was much, 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 much higher, to undermine communism than there was in the US to undermine, through, terrorist activities. Wasn't gonna, pull down the White House. Al-Qaeda had, their threat to the US was, a mere fraction of what the likes of Stalin or other, communists faced, so.
We need to keep someone to take the second question. Just keep things
Sure.
along.
So your second question is on why don't we pursue something higher corporation taxes?
So I'd say lower corporation tax can generate more revenue. The recent Cameron government, for example, lowered income tax and generate revenue.
It's the latter curve principle you're talking about.
Right. Go down, trickle down. Reagan route, but.
Okay, well, I guess the reason that we wouldn't pursue that in terms of it may generate revenue in the short term, but I think there's a lot of questions about longevity which we need to consider. So, for example, we have a lot of debt in these countries who pursued these policies. We've got a lot of deficit that's built up from these from these large, this accommodation to businesses. And I mean, I think there's one thing that we need to clarify when we're talking about capitalists. It's not that capitalist governments have no stance at all. they do plan things. They do use resource allocation. They do put in government programs into initiatives and try and like nuclear power, like the internet. Like, these are all kind of things which are being like built up that way. So I think what happens is, in a long-term sort of thing, when these businesses are given free rein to make profit from these kind of things which are initially government interests and government initiatives, I know this might be not necessarily answering the question, but I think this is basically taking out extra money into an equation where it's like, why isn't it just done by the state and the citizens who are directly in contact with each other, as opposed to bringing in this third player? So I guess the answer is that it's like, we see that there are developments in the future which won't impact us in the long. This won't be beneficial in the long run. This won't be good for the environment. This won't be good for debt. Let's not do it.
Right. Yourself?
Yeah, so I heard the pro-capitalist side there really favoured the idea of raising people out of poverty. Now, I do long-scale demographic research, so I would challenge that. The sense of that, I don't believe it's true. However, Amartya Sen, the liberal scholar, I don't know if you've heard it, he was studying India in particular and looked and said that every 7 years, India puts more skeletons in its closet than China did in its 3 years of shame. The only 3 years in which it had a famine. So we have a capitalist country at a similar level of development in comparison with the communist country, and we have far greater number of deaths from famine. How would you respond to that?
Okay, who wants to take that one?
I don't mind.
Well, you mentioned the poverty thing. Can I comment on that?
Am I about the lifting people from abject poverty or mismanagement?
Well, I mean, if the idea is that you're going to have greater health, fewer number of deaths, and you compare China to India, two countries at a similar level of development. And
so you're talking about
every 7 years, we have more people dying in famines consistently to the present day in India.
Okay.
And there was only one famine in China. It only existed for 3 years.
The 1962 to 1965, the economic disaster, which of course was completely economic.
Which brought down the life expectancy.
Yeah.
The same life expectancy that it had been prior to the revolution.
Okay, so you said the point about raising people from abject poverty. The India situation, and India is a specific case, and I'm not sure that India has a laissez-faire system. I think there's a lot of government intervention at local and state level, which is not what we're advocating, and it wouldn't be what we're not advocating on any particular case. We're advocating on the ideology that laissez-faire capitalism is generally better at raising people out of poverty, which is proven by Europe, which is proven by the United States, which is proven by Latin America, which is proven by all of the countries in Latin America that have a capitalistic system like Chile, compared to a country like Brazil, which had a left-wing government up until Sunday, and this is the situation that they're in versus Chile. So what we're talking about is not necessarily individual specific cases that can be pointed at and say this is similar to China. I don't know how the economy in India is managed at a local and federal level. I do know that it's one of the higher countries for corruption, for example. But
so if you found that you did a broad survey study and you found that the indicators for lifespan, caloric intake, and general development and literacy increased in socialist countries relative to capitalist ones, then would you then say that in fact we had sufficient information to show that socialism was...
Of course not. No, because ultimately socialism is immoral. And it's immoral because it forces people to do things.
Because I can send that study to you. So
Guys,
this is actually
sorry, we're going to have to move.
It's a very interesting point, and I would like to read it.
Can I make a quick comment? So the problem. So firstly, as I said, the problem is that again you're extrapolating from a locally valid result into China being better than India, socialist China being better than India.
I had a survey study that shows for all the socialist countries compared to similar developmental levels in capitalism.
But that's
various indicators.
But that's a different empirical perhaps mistake. I use that word hesitantly. But the problem is that you're aggregating from only outcome variables without explaining the mechanism. So if So, for example, theoretically, let's say that socialist countries are the ones, rich countries become socialist countries, right? So let's say that all the richest countries became socialist tomorrow, okay? And then if we did a cross-section of what is the outcome variables in these contexts in terms of employment or wealth or whatever, anything you specify, right? Then in general, those countries would do better, right? But the problem is that if you're only looking at outcomes without looking at mechanisms, you can't analyze or explain why that is, right? And that's no way to base a system off, right? So one of the things that we do in public policy research is we examine both the empirical evidence, which one aspect of that is the outcome variables, but also through which mechanism does that occur? You know, who benefits and who harms, right? I don't think anyone would make the assertion that normatively, socialism is better in every conceivable way in terms of wealth creation, in terms of employment, etc. Right? Because like you don't actually have a mechanistic approach to that, and then in all of the economic literature that we are familiar with, at some point in government intervention, you run into a trade-off, right? Where there's a trade-off between employing people for an extended period of time past their most productive point, past where they should be reskilled in something else, and that's a trade-off between wealth and the welfares of those individuals. I'm not trying to make a normative claim in that context where the wealth creation is better than the provision of income for those people. What I'm saying is that without a mechanism, we have no basis for comparative analysis.
But
all right.
what if
Sorry,
the word
we are gonna have to wrap
So
up.
I know everyone. I'm sorry, guys. We actually are going to have to wrap it up there. So I know everyone in the audience, particularly the communists, must be starving. So we've got some pizza. We've got some pizza over in House 7. So let's not enact a instance of the tragedy of the commons, and let's go enjoy some pizza. Thank you so much, guys, for coming. Bye.